welcome back to fostering inclusion in the workplace. What a cracking start. We heard earlier, didn't we, from Delia Mensitri, talking about all sorts of things around the business case and the legislation, the driver that is the Equalities Act, and actions we can take. And you've all asked some fantastic questions. Please keep those coming. And if you haven't already, do find your way onto your preferred social media platform, whether that's LinkedIn, Twitter. You've already been able to pop some messages on there. Let's do some more. Let's do some more of that as we make our way through the day. And turning to our next speaker, it gives me great joy, indeed pleasure, in all my memories of things fond in the civil service, because our next speaker is a former civil servant, just like me. I mean, her last job was head of ED&I at the Department for Transport, where we bumped into each other more than once. She left the civil service in 2015. I've only just left in September, after a 38-year career, and all the stories I could share. But for now, let's focus on Teresa. She set up a social enterprise together in the UK. She combines being a CEO and working separately as a diversity consultant. Together in the UK is a storytelling platform for sharing stories, those wonderfully powerful anecdotes of our lived experience. I love what Brené Brown has to say about personal stories. Have you heard this one, Teresa? Brené Brown, the fantastic podcaster, webinar, social commentator, she says of personal stories that they are data. They are data with a soul. And I love that. I love that. Teresa's specialisms in diversity are diversity audits, inclusive leadership, and inclusive recruitment. Teresa's with us for about an hour. She's going to talk about the data to support constructive change and creating accountability. And she's going to look at recruiting for success, how we can go about that, progression around rewards and ensuring equity and impartiality in all that we deliver. Please, let's give an electronically warm applause for my dear friend, Teresa Norman. Teresa, over to you.
As Rob said, I'm Teresa. I started in 2015 Together in the UK. It's a non-profit organisation. We're a storytelling platform for migrants to share their story. We solve challenges through storytelling, and often actually people who arrive here may not know about how we recruit, how we do things. So we get people who have experienced this from a migrant perspective to tell their stories in order that people can learn. And we also are looking for the unheard voice. So we believe that if people can tell their stories to an audience, they feel heard and included. We all have a story to tell, but we don't have a platform to tell it. So that's our mission. And I just share some very exciting news that we ran a storytelling competition last year, and we're going to publish in 2023. So do look out for our book. So but I also work as a diversity consultant, and that's why I'm here today. And I've been asked to talk to you about redesigning your recruitment, progression, and reward processes to ensure equal opportunities for all. And since leaving the civil service in 2015, I've worked with a variety of different organizations, and I can share some of the best practice and some of the things that perhaps need to be challenged as we go through the presentation. So what I've been asked to do is talk about using data to support constructive change and to create accountability, to talk about recruiting for success, training interviewers, changing processes and when to take positive action, and progression and rewards to ensure equity and impartiality. So the point of all this is that at the end of this, organizations become more diverse and inclusive. So underrepresented groups are more likely to be employed, and feel comfortable and able to challenge and progress when they're at work. So looking at diversity data first, there are three main sources of diversity data. There's your recruitment diversity data, there's your employee diversity data, and then there's engagement surveys. And that's obviously we have qualitative evidence as well, but those are the three really crunchy things that tell you how you're doing. So let's look first at recruitment diversity data. What you want is diversity data from all candidates. So once somebody starts the application process, you want to know their diversity characteristics. But candidates need to know why you need it. Nobody's going to fill it in, because people can have all kinds of assumptions about why you're asking for it. And they think it's about you, that they want to know that about you, and that maybe you might use that information badly, but actually you don't actually want to know about the particular person. You want to know about the trends and the patterns that it shows. And you want to make absolutely sure that there's a guarantee that's very public that this information is not shared with the panel. And it really must not be shared with the panel. And you must make sure that your recruitment consultants know that this is not to be shared, because it's about patterns. It's not about the individual. So they need to know why you need it and how you will use it. And then I have come across organizations who are diligently collecting all this information and they're not doing anything with it. So of course, there's no point in collecting it if you're not going to analyze it and benchmark it. So your sources of benchmarking might be other organizations in your sector. It might be your competitor, but you need to really see, what is this information telling you? So it tells you which groups are applying. So are you an organization who perhaps there's a story about? Underrepresented groups might not apply to you. And then that means you need to do something about it. And I've heard of a story where an organization was asked why they weren't employing a particular group, and they said they don't apply. So that is the organization's problem. What is happening? Where are you advertising? What is the stories about your organization that it means that a particular group is not applying to you? So that's your issue. It's not the underrepresented groups. You also need to look at how likely different groups are to succeed at the different stages of the process. So I've come across organizations where, for instance, ethnic minorities are as likely to apply as everyone else, but they don't get through the system. So what is that telling you? Is that telling you that there's potentially bias in the system, that the interview process needs to be adjusted? That it gives you so much information when you actually analyze the data. And I used to work at the Department for Transport, and subsequent to my leaving, I looked at their diversity breakdown, and it was very interesting because everything was fine in terms of equity, in terms of it was represented the local population, who was most likely to apply, who was most likely to succeed at interview. But when things fell apart was who was most likely to take up the job. And that implies that there's issues with the security clearance. So all of this data tells you the actions you need to take to ensure that your processes are fair. So it's very, very important that you get the data. I would also recommend constantly that you use ONS categories. This enables you to benchmark its standard. You're not going to be challenged. I wouldn't invent your own. Always use the ONS categories for race, religion, and belief, etc. So on your employee diversity data, this tells you, do you match the local population? So are you representative of the are you representative of the community that you're serving? It can also tell you what groups, if you can do really clever analysis of it, it can tell you what groups are more likely to be promoted. So again, going back to the Department for Transport, the first analysis showed us that Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff were less likely to be promoted. And when we went back, we could actually say it's gone up by 10%. So all the activity we've done has made a difference. We can tell you what jobs different groups are more likely to work in. And it can tell you the groups that are more likely to be invested in. So I've worked with an organization where Black, Asian, minority ethnic staff felt that they were less likely to have their training approved. This gives you the hard data. So you can say, actually, this is your assumption is right or not. So your employee diversity data tells you the action you need to take and if the action you are taking is working. And the Arts Council does something incredibly interesting. It puts the summary of its employee diversity data on its recruitment website. I think that's absolutely brilliant because it tells you how diverse the Arts Council is. And also, if you're thinking, do they employ people like me, you can check it. I think it's a really, really great place to put your employee diversity data, and it shows that you are doing something with it, and there's a reason for people to share their diversity data with you. So your engagement survey data, it tells you all kinds of things. It tells you if you can break it down by protected characteristics. It tells you which groups are more likely to say they've been bullied and harassed, which groups are more likely to say they've faced discrimination, which groups believe that the company values diversity, which groups have confidence in their manager, and it tells you what action you need to take and if the action you're taking is working. So the summary on data is it needs to be reported upwards. So the senior people need to know, and they need to have time built into their busy meetings to reflect on it. So they should be really on top of the analysis of the data, and it needs to form the basis of a plan. And no organization is perfect. There is always more to do. So your plan should build on the progress you've made and address the gaps that your data is showing. And those of you in the public sector know that there's a duty to publish the analyzed data once a year, but it's a very good practice for all companies to adopt because it forces action and challenge, which is a very good thing. So I'm now going to move on to inclusive recruitment, which I've done a lot of work on. So let's just pause on this. So there's ways of writing inclusive job descriptions and advertisements. And you should also think really, really hard about the job title. So is the job title something that the wider world will understand? Or is it something that a few of you understand because it's quite technical and it's unique to you? So I've been working with companies on inclusive recruitment. One of it is challenging the job title, because you need to make it as accessible as possible, and the job title is critical. Can everybody understand that? There's a very, very interesting paper written by Behavioral Insights called Ahead for Hiring, which I highly recommend. It's on the CIPD website. And they talk about the real importance of language. So ideally, you address the candidate in the second person in the ad. So you will. So your language is very friendly. You've probably heard that there's been some research that shows that women will not apply if the words are very aggressive. So, if you need a ninja leader, really puts women off. So, and there's gender decoders that you can use to make sure that the language is inclusive. I also think that the work should be upfront in really understanding what this job is. So I had the privilege of sitting in on some interviews, and there was a very senior job. And at the end of it, there was a reflection that the panel understood the job a lot better. Now, that's very difficult for the candidate. So if it's a difficult senior job, the work should always be really upfront. Does everybody really understand what this role is going to do, so that you can then ask the right questions. I also, when I'm working with companies, I challenge words like knowledgeable and committed. So I can, I'm knowledgeable and committed, but there are jobs that I am not suitable for. So I think you need to not use high-flown language. You need to think, okay, we want somebody who's knowledgeable and committed, but what do we want them to be knowledgeable about? And how will they demonstrate commitment? What kind of commitment are we looking to see? So the language needs to be really clear and plain and easy to understand and friendly. And this takes work, because lots of us maybe are thinking about quite complicated jobs. There's lots of new jobs coming up in social media, net zero, things like that. So there aren't that many templates, but it's really, really important to do the thinking up front, and the tone of your ad really, really matters. So the more friendly you are, the more inclusive you demonstrate that you are. So use the second person. So that's, and then you need to think about, where do you post the ad? So you might use Indeed, you might use LinkedIn and other places, but you can also post it in other places which are likely to attract more diverse. So, share your link on different Facebook pages to make sure that you are attracting diverse applicants. You also want to brief recruitment consultants that you're expecting a diverse pool of candidates. So that incentivizes them to look for it and share your values with them. The shortlisting, the clearer the criteria that you have, the more objective the decision will be. So, and the fairer. So make sure that everyone understands on the panel what the clear criteria are, and that of course it's best practice in inclusive recruitment that there are at least 2 people doing the shortlisting. And it slightly worries me that some companies have telephone screening by one person before they go to a shortlisting, and then the other, because that you need to have somebody who might challenge potential bias when you're making these selection decisions. The invitation to interview, again, you're setting the tone of what you expect. And sometimes it's very helpful to tell candidates, particularly if it's online, how the interview will go, that they even to actually set some expectations about the dress code. Because, for instance, I was doing some inclusive recruitment training, and some people in the pandemic were saying some people had turned up to an interview in pajamas. Well, then if you actually say you expect semi-business dress, that helps prevent the candidate doing something like that and you making an assumption because they turned up in pajamas. And also, of course, it's really, really important that you ask if anybody needs reasonable adjustments. So, and there's all kinds of reasonable adjustments you might need to make on Zoom, like putting the question in the chat, giving people pauses. So, and then it's incredibly important that not only do you ask for the reasonable adjustment. But this is kind of very obvious, but a council has got themselves into normal trouble by not actually telling the candidate what the reasonable adjustment they were going to make was and making it. So we tell the candidate this is, so the case was, I think it was that somebody stuttered, and so the reasonable adjustment was that they were going to allow the candidate to write their answer, but they didn't tell the candidate, and the council lost at an industrial tribunal. So make sure that you do ask reasonable adjustments, you tell the candidate what you're going to do, and you make it. And then there's masses of things to talk about in the interview. Obviously not to ask questions that imply an intention to discriminate, to ask questions that help the candidate show what they can do. You're not there to sort of show up the candidate. You're there to get the best from them. And to agree the questions and the scoring system. And it is okay to ask follow-up questions. And I think sometimes that makes it fairer. So I was working with one organization who hadn't realized that practice had grown up of, they were taking off points if you had to probe for an answer. And that's about different styles, because some people are more extrovert, can say everything straight away, and some people may need a few more questions, but they still know it. There's also, I found some really fascinating research which said that if you, which is conducted in America, and I'm sure we can all relate to this, that psychology students were asked, what would they do if somebody asked them offensive questions in an interview, like, do you think you're attractive? The students all said that they would walk out, and then they actually did the interview. And in the end, nobody walked out. They just stumbled, they lost their thread, they couldn't speak anymore, because being asked an aggressive question puts you in fight or flight. So you're now, you've asked the candidate because you think that they can do the job, and you've now put them into a position where they're proving to you you can't. So you need to always be warm, inclusive, and friendly in order to get the best out of the interview. So there's, very basic things like smiling, keeping a warm atmosphere to help the candidate, because you think the candidate can do the job, because that's why they're at the interview. So keep it very warm and friendly, and don't put them into fight or flight. And then you've got decision making, and that of course is the tough time of actually, you've gone through this process, and it's one of the biggest decisions you make about who you're going to take, and you want to make sure that you are making the best decision and you've got the best candidate for the job. So I did hear quite recently somebody challenging the recruitment, how a panel will think about it, because they said this is not our usual kind of person. So if somebody says that, you need to challenge that and say, well, and things like that. You also need to have looked after yourself. This is kind of a basic thing about unconscious bias. It happens when we're tired, when we're stressed, when we're on automatic thinking. You might have heard about it's contested research about the judges who are more likely to be less lenient on you if they're tired and hungry. So one thing that really helps your inclusive recruitment process is to look after yourself. And I do know in the public sector that many of the decisions are made that day as to whether which candidate. It's actually better not to make the decision that day. It's better to sleep on it, think about it, take time, because this is such an important decision. but I know this is me talking about in an ideal world. So, and I will just share with you, I've been working with an NHS trust, which has done something which I think is really, really interesting and innovative. It has asked members of the Black, Asian, minority ethnic network to train and put them through to volunteer to be panelists for more senior jobs, because they've made a rule that for Band 8 and above, you must have a diverse panel, which must include someone from an ethnic minority. So, and they've put everybody through training so that and then HR manages this volunteer list so that a recruiter can go to HR and say, we haven't got somebody who's an ethnic minority in our team, we need somebody on the panel, and somebody is trained, and then that gives people exposure to actually the interview process and to a very senior decision-making moment. So what we do in I was asked to talk about inclusive recruitment training. It tends to be that you talk about the legislation to make sure that people understand what the legislation requires and that they do not ask questions that imply an intention to discriminate. Unconscious bias really works in inclusive recruitment training because it's context specific. So it should always be a part of this, because people do need to be aware that it's possible that decisions are made on preconceptions, and then best practice. And so if people actually have an opportunity to practice an interview and get feedback, that's very, very powerful. So what can you do to change the outcomes? One, of course, is you analyze your data and you do outreach to encourage different groups to apply. And I'm sure some of you have come across some of the brilliant work that's done in engineering and STEM subjects, going into schools, getting in early. I've also come across, say, housing associations that get into schools to talk about the range of jobs available. So sometimes it's about starting early, looking at the whole career path. Sometimes it's about projecting your image, making sure that you've got diverse, genuine images on your website. There might be a need for support outside the interview process. So this is obviously not, if you're on the panel, you can't do this, to help candidates understand the requirements and the process. So for instance, the NHS points people to YouTube videos about actually what to expect and how to prepare for an interview. So that's the kind of thing I mean by you might need for particular groups of people, like say young people, to help them understand the requirements in the process, mentors. Positive action is appropriate when it's evidence-based, but positive discrimination is illegal. So I still get people telling me that they don't agree with positive discrimination. And the only time you can appoint somebody based on their protected characteristics is everything is equal between them, and your data tells you that the particular group is underrepresented. But we can and indeed should take positive action. So I'm now going to talk about progression. So basically, the gender pay gap and the ethnic minority pay gap, as far as I can see, are caused by who is more likely to be in the senior posts. So currently, the gender pay gap is 15.6% in favour of men, and the ethnicity pay gap is largest in London, and it's 21.7%. So clearly there's a problem. So what can we do? So first of all, it's understanding the barriers to progression. So is there potentially some bias in the system? Are you expecting people to look like you? are you expecting people to have a number of years experience? So that's potentially discriminatory in adverts and might prevent, say, women who've taken time out to have children applying. Are you expecting people to conform, to be like you? Are there reasons that you expect conformity, so therefore somebody who might be quite brilliant but is not conforming is not moving up the hierarchy? So this I think is very helpful. This is the pie theory of promotion, and is that this theory says promotion depends on your performance, your image, and your exposure. How much exposure are you getting to senior people, to senior tasks? So exposure can be, for instance, you have an acting up opportunity, and it could be that if you're from an underrepresented group, people are less likely to think of you because we all think about people like ourselves a bit quicker. So you may be likely to have less exposure. And one of the things I cite is when I was at the Department for Transport, the permanent secretary at the time, he issued an invitation for anyone to shadow him for a day. And I mean, that's an amazing opportunity. I did it. And to see these incredibly important senior decisions being made and the process by which they made them. But it was like somebody like me can think, okay, I'll take up that opportunity. But when I then told my team, there's this invitation, I've done it, it's fine, you still do it, then they took advantage and they did it. So it was a brilliant initiative, very equal by the permanent secretary, but people needed a push to take it up. But something like that is sort of easily done. It doesn't cost very much money, and you get exposure to the top of the office. But you really need to think about who is getting the opportunities that lead to promotion, and how can you make sure that they are equal. So, for instance, some companies say that if there's an acting up opportunity that will last more than 3 months, it has to be advertised. But there are other ways that people get exposure. So this is slightly controversial, but if you link it, positive action, development programs for underrepresented groups. Now it's controversial because people think it's actually up to the institution to change its systems and procedures, and not more development for underrepresented groups. But I think if you link this to exposure and you make the positive action development programs opportunities for people to connect to the top of the office, then I think you're squaring this circle. And then you need to reward managers for the career development of their staff. There's a really, really interesting book called Belonging by Sue Unerman and others. And she talks about you have to have the people with power in the room. And they need to become ally sponsors and mentors. So it's very important that the people in power are part of the inclusive conversation, because they're the people who can make the difference. So trying to get back to my, it's not letting me do it, let me get back. So the reward for your company is a diverse workforce that represents its customers and its community. And therefore, if it's commercial, more business. If it's in the public sector, more understanding of the community. And ultimately, this leads to better decision making. Because if I'm very interested in the unheard voice, and when I look at sort of corporate catastrophes that have happened, there's often one person who is speaking out, who is trying to prevent this happening, who is marginalized in some way. So it could be because they're young, it could be because they're different in some way to the norm. So I'll just finish with, this really fascinating example on bad blood, which is about Theranos, this enormous corporate fraud, which in America, and a 22-year-old tried to tell his grandfather, George Shultz, Secretary of State, that this was a fraud, it wasn't working. George Shultz said, they're trying to tell me you're stupid. I don't believe you're stupid, but I do believe you're wrong. So this young man who got it absolutely right was being stereotyped and marginalized by his youth. So this I think is a very powerful story about actually the business case for diversity and inclusion, because we make better decisions and we avoid catastrophic ones. So I think that is it. I'm not quite sure if I've spoken for as long as I was meant to, but we can take some questions and have some debate.
Wow. Wow. You could, well, in my book anyway, Teresa, you could carry on for as long as you like. I tell you, I could show you my notes. I've written half of my first book. Teresa, thank you. I will make sure you're credited, Teresa. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for opening up the conversation, even more so than our first speaker, or taking on from our first speaker, Delia. So thank you for that. I'm going to dive straight into the questions, if that's all right, Teresa. You good for that?
Sure.
Yeah, brilliant. Great stuff. Well, let me be amongst the first to say thank you very much. We've got some comments coming in. Let's pick up these questions for now as we head towards the end of this session. We've got, just to cut our cloth, we've got about 20 minutes, Teresa, so we'll take it nice and easy. Let's kick off with this question. I'll quote, we are collecting D&I monitoring data, but we have low numbers of candidates completing this information. What's key comms, I mean, messages or actions have you seen that really drive up those numbers? You did touch on this during your presentation, and confidence of people completing the information. I know both you and I have been involved in those kind of campaigns and drives, and I think you touched on it, didn't you? People have got to know why you're collecting the data, don't they?
They have to know why you're collecting it. They have to know that it's confidential. They have to know who has access to it. So, absolutely public about who are the people who have it, because it shouldn't be very many people. And then they have to see that you will take action on it, and that this is really important. The decisions are made on this, and that it is not about them. It is really not about them as an individual. You do not want, it's not personal. You're not going to act on prejudice, because you're not going to know who the person is. What you're looking for is the pattern.
And as an extension of that, Teresa, I just wondered, in your experience, have there been any clever ways of driving that figure up? I mean, do people respond better when they know, this, it got used to deliver this, and here's a positive outcome, for example?
Yeah, I think if there's a positive outcome, it's great. If it's published, like the way the Arts Council does, and also make it as unonerous as possible. So it's quite onerous for you, the person trying to get the data. And there's been some interesting research from the Behavioural Insights on this. They did an experiment, the nudge unit, and they said you have to ask 3 times. You ask 3 times in a 2-line email where you're saying, this is why we're collecting it, this is confidential. So it's a very short email, and you give the link, and if people want to know more, they can find out on another link. It takes 3 times. I mean, probably it takes 3 times in life anyway to be asked to do anything, but you have to keep going out. And they said, which I wasn't actually 100% sure about, that if you identify the people who haven't filled it in and go to them 3 times, but I would think it's safer to go to everyone, but it's 3 times. And also make it part of induction, so that when people are filling out all the forms and all the things that they have to do to join, it's just another thing that they do.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, it takes a lot of effort to get people to fill it in, but it's really important.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Teresa. And do keep the questions coming, folks. Perhaps only a slight segue, but into the area of sticking with data, but the actual way in which we can share data. And you touched on some of the sensitivity around that, and there are obvious the obvious parameters around this. But I wanted to know, I was at a conference recently, Teresa, and they said, if it matters, measure it, and if it really matters, publish it.
That's good.
Well, what do you think about that?
I think there's lots of things that are quite important, that are quite hard to measure, but I do think this is sort of fundamental to your diversity strategy and to your action. So I would publish. I think what the Arts Council does is absolutely brilliant. Publishing your data on your recruitment site says so much about you and your openness. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, right, let's turn to our questions. Claire has come through with a question. Thank you, Claire. Do you advocate anonymizing processes where possible?
Yeah, I think I could have mentioned that in the presentation. I think there's lots and lots of research saying how much less likely you are to get a positive response if you have a name that is clearly associated with being an ethnic minority. And I've heard individuals tell me that when they changed their name or shortened it to make it look more Anglo-Saxon, then they started getting offers for jobs, which is terrible.
Wow.
And it's really terrible to hear. So the response to this, which seems to me reasonable, has been to anonymize application forms. I know people still put in kind of things that you can sort of recognize who they are. So there's ways of gaming that. But I think it's a good thing to do that, to at least try and counter this prejudice. And that's the response to that research. So I think it's worth going. It's worth doing. Yeah.
Teresa, can I turn to, you mentioned a paper that can be found on the CIPD website. I think you said Ahead for Hiring.
Yeah.
Can you perhaps, can you share a bit more about that paper? Is there anything?
Yeah.
How long is it? Is it how researched? Is it something we should just dive into and read ourselves?
It's really interesting paper about all the stereotypes and biases that can come up during the interview process. It was commissioned by the CIPD by the Behavioural Insights Unit, and it's got some really, really helpful things in. So I use it as one of my major sources. About your tone really matters. They advocate quite a lengthy process of double checking your decision making, and talk about how to get into type B thinking. Your type B thinking is, it's the Daniel Kahneman example. It's deep reflective thinking.
System 1, system 2. We've done a lot of work with that out of Crystal Alliance, our consultancy, and we do a lot around organizational mindfulness, which incidentally, listeners, is a great book by Andrew McNeil. Do check that out, Organizational Mindfulness, and we lean on Daniel Kahneman's work captured in his great book, Thinking Fast and Slow.
I mean, and I'm seeing, I don't know whether other participants, I'm seeing that actually there's more and more of a need for consultants, because something has happened in the pandemic, and everybody who's still employed is working 3 times as hard as they ever were. So I'm getting feedback at weekends, late at night, because nobody has any time. And that makes it much harder to do type B thinking, which is so critical when you're making these big decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, couldn't have put that better. Thank you. A supplementary, I think, or it might be a different territory, but Claire's come back with this. Your comment about an organization's story and whether that attracts or repels candidates really resonated for her. She's asking, have you got some examples of how organizations have seized control of their story and turned it around?
I think I've seen Mercedes are doing some brilliant things now with their social responsibility and their policies. Okay, this might be kind of easier if you're Mercedes, but they've got Lewis Hamilton to sponsor STEM work in schools in disadvantaged areas in London. Yeah. So that's they're doing some brilliant work. HS2 is very, very well known for its diversity and inclusion work.
Yeah. Yes.
I just
headed up by Mark Lomas.
Yeah. So there's companies out there that are doing. I mean, I was really interested to actually see in Black History Month what Coutts was doing. Coutts had an extraordinary display in the Strand, poster of Marcus Rashford. It put on its walls. We're committed to 100,000 Black, Asian, minority, ethnic interns. Strong statement by the chief executive. Interesting, and I do look out for these things. And I heard, I'm afraid I can't remember who it was, but I heard somebody on Desert Island Discs talking about how he had experienced terrible racism at work. And the chief executive wrote to everybody saying, if you did this, you do not belong here. You are not living our values. Yeah. And that meant so much to the person who shared this example that happened a long time before. And he was telling that story about that company. So doing the right thing kind of has multiplier effects. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and from the top makes it kind of amplifies the intent. Thanks for that question, Claire. I've alongside Teresa's response, thanks for that, Teresa, I popped a reference into the impact report that are out, published online and available from Included. And I've just popped the link to that there. You might want to check that out. There's a couple of really powerful case studies around the Bank of England, who I mentioned earlier. There's also some fantastic work that was done at the Wellcome Trust around listening to sections of their staff via a inclusion diagnostic that then was fed back into the information and the systems that they then changed. So have a look at that. Another question, Teresa, if you're up for it. Sure.
Desmond Matali has come back with another question. Thanks, Desmond. How do you get diversity in recruitment right for newly created organizations? If you're starting from fresh. Sounds like a wonderful opportunity, doesn't it? It's a blank canvas. We can get this right from the get-go. I guess it's pretty much how grandparents might feel when they can start all over again with new members of the family. But, you know, and I speak from experience, but there we are. Desmond's question, how do we get recruitment right for newly created organizations?
I think you need to get the processes right. So you probably want to recruit quite fast, but it's actually, I don't think it's that different, but it's making sure the job titles are right, that the role description, whatever you want to call it, is really clear. It doesn't have to be too long. It just has to be really clear. This is the purpose of the role. This is what you'll be doing, and this is what you need to apply. and sort of so, and then, oh yeah, the critical thing that I should have said is you need to have your diversity statement right up front in your ads, so that it really matters that you have a dynamic diversity statement. So I would say spend some time thinking about, what does diversity and inclusion mean to you? How will you put it in your adverts so that people see it and they think, yeah, this is the kind of company I want to work for. And then I'd make sure your recruitment processes are straightforward. You know, the interview process, there can be a temptation. You know, Google famously did stuff like work out how many tires there are in London. It just, what are you testing?
Yeah.
When you put somebody like that, you know, you might want to test their analytical thinking, but don't throw curveballs. You know, there can be a temptation to be a bit wacky when you're a new company, but what you want to do, always bear in mind, is that what you think this candidate can do the job, that's why they're at the interview.
Yeah, there's a simplicity to it. I like that. And turning to that simplicity, you gave a wonderful example during your presentation, Teresa, around not just asking for knowledgeable and committed. You know, particularly with an audience such as this, I'm sure we can find lots of knowledgeable, lots of committed, but specifically, clearly, plainly, what are you after when you talk about knowledgeable in what and committed in what? Have you got any other examples that pop into your mind about how we can get the wording on that advert or the blurb? How can we get that right? How can we do better at that? You and I are both, we're both former civil servants, and we know how wrong we can get these things. So, which is a polite way of saying there's room for improvement. But what can we do?
I think you can check it with somebody who does not understand your world at all. Does this, one thing that I'm doing when I'm coaching managers is I say, tell me what's exciting about this job. And so, are you conveying this? And are there words in it that people don't understand, you know, that are management speak, that are perfectly clear to you? So we want somebody who's a strategic thinker and a good organizer. So how will somebody show you that they're a strategic thinker? What are you looking for? You might want somebody who has put in a plan for 3 years. Somebody can check so think when you're writing this thing, how is somebody going to show you that they've got it or not? But really, I don't like management speak at the best of times, but in an advert, it's not helpful at all.
Sure. Thanks for that. And again, back to Desmond, thank you for that question. Any supplementaries, do type them in. We've got literally about 7 minutes with Teresa before we're into overtime. And you don't want to see her rates for overtime, folks. I'm only joking. Ruth has asked this question, Teresa. What steps can be taken to remove or reduce affinity bias during the interview process? That's a tricky one, isn't it?
It is a tricky one. It's one, being aware of it. And two, it's having a diverse panel. And this, I've heard, you know, people say, minority candidates saying it really made a huge difference to me if somebody looked like me in the panel. So the diversity of the panel is really, really important, particularly for senior jobs. And double checking yourself. You know, do you really connect with this person because they went to the same university, they support the same football team, that sort of thing. Avoid questions that might, you know, which sound really friendly, but actually might lead to you making that affinity bias.
It's really, it reminds me, you know, a while back now, about 7 or 8 years ago, I was on a recruitment campaign, Teresa, and a 3-member panel. And I remember one member of the panel who quite significantly, enough that both of us, the other 2 members, had a conversation about it when the candidate left the room, but they had bonded with the individual because their address was in the same postcode as she was in. And for that reason, that you could see that Their scores were a little bit higher than they had been. They were a little bit, and they didn't actually know, they didn't even realize it until we'd kind of shone a light on it. And it was all because their address came from the same area as them.
Yeah, and addresses really should not be on the app. Or you should not see somebody's
It's
address.
about 8 years ago. It's gone now. But you know, and I think it's for things like that why it has gone. But you know, there we are.
Yeah.
We've got, just to close us off, and that was a final question that's come through anyway from Ruth. Thank you for that, Ruth. Great question to shine a light on it there. I've asked this of our previous speaker, and I'll be asking it going forward, Teresa. So I'll ask you now, anything that you've read, I mean, you've mentioned a few already, but anything else that you've read, listened to, or watched recently from any sphere, Netflix perhaps, maybe a podcast that you're listening to at the moment, or a book that you'd like to recommend for our listeners?
Oh, that's not fair. One book.
You're allowed one of each. Go on then. You quickly give us one of each.
Right. I've been reading Natives, History of Class, Colonialism, and something else. And there seems to be a trend at the moment for doing political analysis and telling your story. And it made me think, from what happened to this author, I made me think, unconscious bias training, it's really worth it, because what happened to this now lecturer at Cambridge when he was at school is clearly a result of prejudice and bias. So for me, that is the evidence that actually it's worth a go, unconscious bias. So I think that I found very, very powerful. So
are you quoting from a book, did you say, Teresa, or is it a paper?
It's a book. It's a book.
Yeah. What's it called?
Natives.
Oh, by Carla.
Yes.
Yes, great book. Great book. It's with me. It's with me here in my office. Great book.
Oh, thank you. Somebody's already put it in. Unfortunately, sometimes words at my age.
I hear you. Well, that's another conference. Let's leave that there, Teresa. And with that lovely smile, thank you for sharing a wonderful presentation and for being such a up for and sport in answering all those questions and responding. It's recorded. It's there for playback for those who have made it here today and those who couldn't get along in the final bit. But wishing you well for the rest of your day and the upcoming weekend, and all the work that you do together in the UK, and all those wonderfully rich stories that are such an important part of the fabric of our society. Thank you so much.
Please, can I just say, please check out the website togetherintheuk.co.uk, and thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You heard it there. You heard it there, folks. Let's check out the website Together in the UK. Thank you, Teresa. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.